Hello, everybody. Today we are here with David Pallmann, and we are going to talk about the topic of traditional gospel authorship. Is traditional authorship correct, or are the gospels anonymous? So, hi, David. How are you doing?
I've had better days. I got a pretty bad cold today, but that's all right. If you end up smoking me in the conversation, I'll just blame it on the cold. So it gives me an excuse.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I doubt that because David is one of the, at least in YouTube, is one of the guys that knows the most about gospel authorship, I think. And he has a video that goes very, very deep into that. So I'm gonna link to the video, so you guys, if you want to take a look at that topic, go check that out. So you want to tell us a little bit about your channel or your interest in this topic, or or your video, or about the video you made about authorship?
Yeah. So the video is kind of a passion project of mine because I've been kind of interested in the issue of gospel authorship for a while. And I thought there was a lot of interesting material out there on it, and it just didn't have like a single place where you could get all of it. So I was trying to make my video the place where I could sort of bring all of the interesting insights that are out there, a bunch of diverse pieces of scholarly literature, and just bring it all together in one place. But yeah, I mean, I defend the robust traditional authorship of the Gospels. So I think that they're written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, perhaps with some qualifications. And I give broadly 3 lines of evidence, from manuscript evidence, internal clues, and then the most time is, of course, spent on external attributions. And a little more than just listing the traditional, the second century writers who name Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as the authors. I decided to do a little work of rebutting people like Bart Ehrman and Richard Carrier, people who have criticized these authors, said that they're not trustworthy, not talking about the canonical Gospels, things of that nature. Because I like to push the conversation forward on my channel. And of course, I know you like to do the same over here. So that's why I'm glad we're having the conversation today.
Yeah, that's great. I appreciate that. So, if it's okay, I would like to start by making my negative case against gospel authorship. I think last time we talked about this a little bit, and you made like your positive case. You can make it today again, of course, but I want to start by giving the reasons why. So the reasons I will use against gospel authorship. So I will just present these 4 points. Point number 1 is that the Gospels are written in the third person. They are not written in first person singular, like I, Matthew, saw this and that, was with Jesus. And the authors don't identify themselves in the text, right? They don't tell you, okay, I was Matthew, I saw this. The second point, I think for me, this is the strongest one, is that the attributions are a bit way too late. They are around 180 AD. I think Irenaeus is the first one who mentions all gospel authors by name. I think this is like 100 years after they have been written, and this is a bit weird. How come people only not start telling us that so many years later? The third point is a point that Bart Ehrman makes a lot. He says that the disciples were unlikely to be able to create a text in Greek like that. It's a text that has rhetorical, and it's a complex, fluent Greek. And he says only a highly educated Greek speaker would have been able to do these kind of things. And the fourth, I think atheists rarely make this argument like explicitly, at least, but I think it's a strong argument. I think it's a relatively strong argument, and it's the fact that these attributions took place in a context where many false attributions were already present, many forgeries. We have many fake attributions. We have many apocryphal gospels, many fakes. People saying, "Oh, people saying, oh, this was written by Barnabas. This was written by Thomas." Whatever. All the time we see it, and the gospels are like part of the same community. So yeah. So I'm gonna start one by one. So the first one, I'm gonna show a quote here, and it's the fact that the authors don't identify themselves as eyewitnesses, and I think it's likely that they would have done it. So let me show you this again. This quote. Let me just show you this quote from a paper I read somewhere. To ancient historiographers from Herodotus onward, the claim of autopsia, being an eyewitness, gave an immediate air of reliability. In these cases, the accuracy of the narrated events was guaranteed by the personality of the historian who had witnesses. Narrating a history from a personal point of view was the more authoritative stance for ancient historiographers. By way of contrast, disguising one's identity was not so well received. Historians like Herodotus, Thucydides, and Polybius all started their works by presenting themselves to the audience. Keeping one's identity hidden will negatively affect the reliability of a historical work. So, yeah, that's what I found somewhere. So it seems like if they were witnesses, the gospel authors were witnesses or were related so directly to witnesses, it makes sense that they would have said so, like Luke does, right? But they will explicitly say so, like more at the beginning. So I don't know, what do you think of this?
Well, I'm glad you brought up Luke, because that was kind of where I wanted to start. This isn't the main rebuttal that I would give to that argument, but a point to make is that I think, and I'm not saying you in particular, but I think a lot of skeptics are kind of disingenuous when they put this argument forward, because the indication is that, well, if they were written in the first person, if they presented themselves as eyewitnesses, then like the skeptic would accept traditional authorship, right? That's kind of how it puts forward. Until we get to Acts, when Luke does use the first person plural, saying we in the passages, and the skeptics are like, no, that's got to be a literary convention that they just use for, naval travel in the day and blah, 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 right? So there's kind of like a bit of, I think it's presented disingenuously a lot, because it's not like they're going to accept it even if you had first person, because you do have that in the case of Luke, right? Similarly, in John, you do have a statement, not a first-person one, and we can get into my perspectives on John because it's a little unusual. But in John, you definitely do have an in-text identification of the author as an eyewitness and apostle. Now, as just for the more general point of things being written without identifying the author or being written in third person, the main response that I would give here is that while sometimes ancient historians did identify themselves in the written body of text, quite often they also did not, right? The classical examples here are going to be Tacitus and Plutarch, right? They don't identify themselves within their written body of texts. The way that they are known is from later external attributions or manuscripts and so on and so forth. The other point I think that I would make there is that Simon Gathercole has a very interesting paper where he argues that there's actually just tons of examples of, things being written without the author being named explicitly in the text. I believe the paper is called The Alleged Anonymity of the Canonical Gospels, or of the Gospels, something to that effect, where he just goes through tons of examples where this just happens in ancient historiography. As for third person, I like to highlight the example of Julius Caesar's Conquest of Gaul, sometimes known as the Gallic Wars, published under either title. But I mean, Julius Caesar explicitly writes about himself in the third person all the time there, and yet nobody questions that Julius Caesar is the author of at least the first 3 books. So those are kind of my thoughts on this general line of argument.
So do you remember a small channel called Hats of History that made a response to you? I saw that video. Well, he had a response to this third person thing. He said that for those cases, like there were reasons why it was written in the third person, right, that do not apply to the Gospels. Right? I think one guy was trying to remain hidden even, and I think Caesar, I don't know, I don't think the response was super strong there. I kind of agree that I think Caesar invented the style of, I don't know if he invented it, obviously. I don't know if somebody before that, but I'm okay with thinking, okay, he came up with that idea of, he wanted to present the text like for people to read it to others, and wanted to make to like sound good. So like Caesar did this and that, and you're going to say, well, the Gospels maybe had the same idea, but I think it wasn't that common so that we can say, okay, well, it's very we can totally expect the gospel authors to do that, right? So I have to ask here, it's a genuine question, it's not a trick question. I don't know what is the answer. When you say there are some examples, is it like really a lot of high percentage of works where like that, let's say 30%, or is it more like you went and found the 2 or 3 examples out of 100, right? And then you think that this is like refutes the point.
Yeah, I haven't run the numbers to come up with exact percentages. Those are kind of the examples those are my go-to examples because I think they're the clearest ones. There are plenty of other examples that Simon Gathercole goes through in his paper, and I definitely don't have them all memorized offhand. As you pointed out, Hats Off History explained that some of these cases are not going to be as clear as like the Julius Caesar case or the Tacitus and Plutarch case. Maybe there are cases where the author's trying to remain hidden. I think the point here, though, is just to point out that this shouldn't be a deal breaker on its own, right? If you think that Julius Caesar wrote The Conquest of Gaul, despite describing himself in the third person, on the basis of external testimony, in principle, that should be good enough for the Gospels. Same thing with Tacitus and Plutarch, not naming themselves in the text, but being known on the basis of later testimony. If that's good enough for Tacitus and Plutarch, in principle, that should be good enough for the Gospels. That's the general point that I want to make there. Not that I'm saying that this is always how it was done or that it was incredibly common, but it certainly is not unheard of.
Yeah. Well, I asked ChatGPT about this, and I've been playing with that. And ChatGPT said that writing in third person was indeed relatively common, but they are not being anonymous wasn't that common. But that's what ChatGPT said. ChatGPT could be wrong, so I don't know. What do you think of that? If this is true or not?
Yeah, AI is obviously, as you pointed out in one of your videos, it's a bit hit and miss as a research tool. It can be like handy to ask quick questions, but of course it's good to verify what it says. But I mean, that has been my impression from what I've, again, read from scholars, primarily Gathercole is who I'm drawing from, is that this style of writing is certainly not unheard of.
Yeah. Okay, from what I know about scholars, I think what they most disagree with is Matthew and John. I think this is the more controversial ones. But actually, when it comes to Mark, for example, I think it's about a fifth. Mike Licona, I think, made a video on a blog post. I don't know. He says it's very 50-50, actually, even maybe a bit more scholars who think Mark wrote Mark. So it's maybe the case is not that bad for Mark. And for Luke, again, many people think, yeah, sure, Luke did wrote Acts. But these are precisely the less direct witnesses, right? But when it comes to Matthew and John, then scholars are more skeptical, I think, right? You want to say something about this? What have you?
Yeah, I don't know that Licona is necessarily correct about that. I think that there is certainly a little bit less skepticism towards Mark and Luke because that's getting you one removed from eyewitnesses, so there's less motivation to reject those ones. But as far as I again haven't run the numbers on this, I do know that Licona has a bit of a bad habit of pulling some of his numbers from Gary Habermas, and I know Gary Habermas is very unreliable when it comes to citing numbers. So I would want more verification than Licona says it's 50-50. But I think you are correct that generally there's going to be a little bit less animosity towards Mark and Luke, just because, again, even if you grant those authors, they're not eyewitnesses. And that's one other point I think relevant to this whole writing in the third person argument. It's certainly not going to be an argument against the traditional authorship of Mark and Luke that they write in third person, because you would expect that they wouldn't have been eyewitnesses. Right. So at best, that is actually only an argument against Matthew and against John.
Yeah, that's right. So you cannot say how come 4 gospels decided to do this unlikely thing. No, you have only 2, right, that decided to take this style. But yeah, I mean, okay, maybe we can move on to the next one, which I think for me, I think is probably the strongest. I think is that the fact that the attributions are too late, and this is a table showing the attributions at what year is it on. And the funny thing is that this was shown by in Spanish philosophy, actually making the case that the attributions are very unanimous, right? And they're very all over the world, all over the church in a wide geographical area has unanimous attribution. And Papias is the caveat here is like the one much earlier than the rest. So you cannot really say, oh yeah, everyone is super late, right? There is one example case that ruins the point for the skeptic a little bit, and it's Papias. But last time I was talking to Richard Carey, he says he thinks Papias is 130 the year, and you think you want to put it at 90. I know, so there is another that's another for things. I don't know.
Yeah. Carrier puts Papias like way later than anyone I've ever seen. Yeah, I've never seen anyone else put Papias as late as Carrier does in his book. And I think he, if I'm remembering correctly, in On the Historicity of Jesus, when he talks about Papias, he even acknowledges that like he's kind of putting him later than most people. I don't remember if he gives the standard sort of argument for dating Papias super late. I have a rebuttal to that, but we don't have to necessarily get into that. No, I can give you my general reasoning for putting him earlier if you want.
If that's okay. Yeah, sure.
Generally, I would say he's probably writing sometime between 95 and 107 AD. The reason for that is I think he talks about the composition of the Gospel of John, which I'm going to put sometime in between 90 and 95. So I think he has to be writing after that. And then I think he's writing prior to Ignatius, who's writing, 107. Polycarp writing after that in like 108. And in ecclesiastical history, Eusebius has this running chronicon of dates where he sort of like lines up the chronology of events, and where he places Papias is between the Apostle John right at the end of the 1st century, and then Ignatius at the start of the 2nd century. So I think anywhere in between that 95 and 107 date, that's about where I want to place Papias. So I'm not saying he's definitely 1st century, but I do say that is where Eusebius places him, and I do see kind of room for that there. But I'm okay with it if he's very early 2nd century as well.
Right. So, and part of the argument that I'm making, why someone will ask, okay, but was there anyone like before that would have mentioned we would have expected that person to mention the titles of the Gospels, right? Because if there wasn't anybody, then this doesn't matter. And I think there are a few candidates. I'm going to show it here. For example, Ignatius, I think 105 seems to quote Matthew. Polycarp again seems to quote the Gospels. I think 3 of them. The Epistle of Barnabas is a good example because he quotes Matthew without naming it, but it also quotes the book of Enoch. And when it does so, it names it. It says the book of Enoch says this and that. I think the Didache also quotes Matthew, but it says as it is said in the Gospel of the Lord or something like that. I don't remember. And Justin Martyr also talks about the Gospels, but refers to them as members of the apostles. So it's like we see this previous. So that also adds to the other point, right? So how come only in the year around the year 180 we start getting like clear people really talking about the Gospel of Matthew, and it's a bit weird if people know who wrote that over 100 years ago. People have already known who were the authors of these documents, right?
Yeah, I think we would actually have roughly the same explanation for why you get this sort of explosion of references to the Gospels by name in sort of like the 170s, 180s. Later part of the 2nd century AD. Why is it that you suddenly get the big influx of names, whereas you've kind of got patchier details before then? I think we want to give the same explanation, which is that you started having heretics come along and start questioning, tossing out certain books, questioning the authenticity of others. So it becomes a fight at that time. And so that's why you all of a sudden have all these people standing up to defend the apostolic authority behind the 4 canonical Gospels, because that's when it becomes a controversy. It doesn't seem to have been a huge controversy prior to that. Even, in fact, this is something I kind of wanted to get to. Even like the Gnostics before that point had accepted like at least the apostolic authorship of John, for example. I would argue we can show that in Irenaeus when he's interacting with the Valentinian Gnostic Ptolemy in Against Heresies 3. He's interacting with this guy who is writing around the 140s, and he says that John wrote the fourth gospel. So, well, he doesn't say fourth gospel. He says John wrote and then quotes from our Gospel of John. So, I mean, it seems like the Gnostics weren't fighting at that point about at least like the authorship of John. It's only later on when it sort of becomes a controversy. That's why I think you suddenly get the big influx of names in like the 180s and onwards. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So just to be clear, the controversy is not whether the traditional authorship were this or that ones. The controversy is which gospels were authoritative, right? Or what do you mean? Which controversy are you talking about? I don't know. I'm not sure.
I'm not talking about anyone in particular. Well, I mean, so you had like the Elogi coming about at this point. They're challenging the authorship of the fourth. Well, from what little we know about this group, if they existed at all, they're challenging the authorship of the Gospel of John. I wasn't referring to any, particular controversy. It's just that you started having them at this point. You have Marcion come up around this point. It's not altogether clear what he's doing, but there's definitely challenges to the apostolic authority of the four gospels. I'm just saying you start having more pushback against the apostolic authority of the four gospels in the late 2nd century. And so that's why you suddenly get this more robust defense of that among Orthodox Christian apologists from that time.
Okay, when they mentioned that, that Matthew wrote the gospel, for example, was that in the context of making a defense for why this document is authoritative? Or was that just in the context of generally explaining to the public, to their audience, like these documents, we got them from Matthew? You know what I mean?
Yeah, it depends. So with Tertullian, it's like a little bit more defensive than in Irenaeus. There's like maybe a hint of defensiveness to that because he's highlighting the apostolic origins of them. But Irenaeus, it's a little more matter of fact than it is in, for example, Tertullian or in Origen, or eventually, obviously, by the time we get to Augustine, it's very clearly being put out there in a defensive way. So it's not like it's immediately presented in a defensive way, but there's a little bit of that in Irenaeus.
Right. So, yeah, I'm not sure. It seems like, okay, I mean, I get your hypothesis, but it seems to me like the fact that this document was written by Matthew, or the fact that the title, we're going to refer to that gospel and quote that gospel. It seems like it's a very important thing to quote. Like you wouldn't omit it, like just because nobody is, contesting that or attacking that or whatever. But it seems to me like something that you will want to tell people or to mention when you're quoting Matthew, like of the gospel that we got from the disciple, directly from the disciple Matthew. Or I mean, something that seems like will be so important to me. It seems like that would be so important that somebody should have mentioned it, before 100, like for 100 years to pass with nobody mentioned, did we got this from Matthew? And
well, I mean, I think that you do have that, right? Obviously, in Papias, right? And I mentioned that I think you have that in Ptolemy, the Valentinian Gnostic, as well. So I think you do have his, and Justin Martyr. I think you also do have. He doesn't, of course, give you direct names, but he does talk about memoirs of the apostles and their followers, right? Which obviously, that requires at least 2 by apostles, at least 2 by followers of the apostles.
Why? No. Why?
Because he uses plural. So it's apostles, plural, and their followers, plural. So you have to have at least two by apostles and at least 2 by their followers to make sense of what Justin says there.
Yeah, you made that point in your video. No, I didn't get it. I think when you say memoirs of the apostles and their followers, it could be one thing, like one full document by like both the apostles and their followers. You know what I mean? Like,
okay, but you would need at least 2 apostles and at least 2 followers involved in that one thing.
I don't really get why. Obviously part of the problem is we're talking about in English, but there was written in Greek or what?
Sure, but it's still plural in Greek, right?
Okay.
If I say, so again, some stuff that like you were saying in the stuff with angels, right? In your video responding to me, right? That if there's multiple angels, then you use the plural, right? You're not going to use the singular or something like that.
Okay.
So in this point, right, if he says that it's the memoirs of the apostles, that can't be one apostle, right?
No, I mean, it could be used like a general. What I'm saying is that could be like a general title that people attach to that. Like this comes from the apostles in general, right? This one document comes from the entire group. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know.
But if it's the entire group, then you have at least two.
Why? Okay, I don't get it. Okay, this is a minor point. Let's not. But I don't get it. I mean, I'm trying to come up with an analogy. You know what I mean?
The point is just to say that what he says there kind of actually maps remarkably well onto our fourfold gospel tradition, because it entails that you've got at least 4 gospels, at least 2 by apostles, and at least 2 by their followers. Could be more than that. You're right, because he doesn't specifically delineate that it's 4. But it's interesting because it's suggestive. And I do think it's hard to say that Justin regarded these as anonymous if he thinks they go back to the apostles and their followers.
Okay, I got a good example. Let's say I tell you, hey, I got this gift from my parents. I got a gift from my parents. It doesn't mean it is still one gift. And I got it from both of them jointly, gave me one gift. So their apostles and their followers jointly made one document. And that could be like it could be referring to one single document. So
well, okay, right? Yeah, that's fine if you want. I think we would have other reasons for thinking that what Justin means by memoirs is that he's talking about gospels. But even if you thought it was one document, the point is you would have to have at least 4 people involved with that. 2 of them would have to be apostles and 2 would have to be followers. I think that's just the point that I want to make.
Okay. Well, we talk about Papias a little bit. We can.
Could I make one further point about Irenaeus?
Yeah, sure.
Because as a lot of skeptics act like it's really significant that you have all of these 2nd century citations of the Gospels, right, leading up to Irenaeus, but there's not like a specific name of them. And just the reason for part of the reason I don't feel a lot of force in that is you have the exact same thing in Irenaeus, right? Like Irenaeus, obviously we all agree Irenaeus believes that the Gospels are written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But all the time he'll just say that, the gospel says this, or like the gospel of the Lord says this, right? Like he will just give you a quotation, not tell you what gospel it's from, not tell you who wrote it. And he does it all the time. And yet no one thinks that means that Irenaeus thought that the gospels were anonymous. Yeah. So I guess my reasoning is, if Irenaeus can do that without thinking the gospels are anonymous, why does this have to mean that like Clement or Justin Martyr or these earlier sources, why does it have to mean that they thought it was anonymous just because they quoted it without naming the author?
Yeah, you're right. You made that point in your video. I don't know how many. I think you gave just one example of Irenaeus quoting talking about members of the apostle, but I don't know if there are many others. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, you just read. I mean, I could give a bunch, but I mean, read through Against Heresies. There's a whole bunch of examples where Irenaeus just gives you a citation to one of the gospels and doesn't say. Now there are other examples where he does say, like, Matthew said this, John said this, right? So it's not consistent throughout, but I think the point still goes through.
Yeah, sure. I think that's fair, right? I think in a way that's also like what I will say is like that was the old name, and Irenaeus remember the old name, like back then. But then they got the new names, and then sometimes he uses the old name. But yeah, I don't know. Okay, so yeah, Papias is a very important witness here because he's the earliest one. He talks about Mark and Matthew. You think he also mentions John and Luke, but I think that's a minority view. Like I never heard this before, other than in your video. I never. But okay, so you can make that case if you want, but the thing I want to say, Bart Ehrman and skeptics love to throw dirt on Papias, and try to say that he's unreliable, right? That and they bring up this example of his story about the death of Judas, right? When he gets that wrong, I think it looks like he's just repeating some urban legend that was going around. Like there's a narration of the death of Judas that contradicts, what the Gospel of Matthew says. And that's interesting because you cannot say, okay, maybe he didn't know the Gospel of Matthew. He says that he knows the Gospel of Matthew. So that one is even weirder, right? That makes it even a bit weirder. And you have an interesting defense of it in your video, right? You think that Papias was like making like a bit of a joke or a comedy, some form of comedy, or like not talking seriously. I know another guy who made that point. James Patrick Holding. Yes. He says what his defense is to say. Papias was doing the equivalent of saying, your mom is so fat that she's his own zip code. That's what he said. And well, you have a justification for that in your video. If you want to, yeah.
Yeah, well, I give a fourfold defense. I'll just briefly go through it. The first one, and I think one that doesn't get enough attention, is that this is a textually messy fragment from Papias. And that's because it's coming to us third hand via... So where we actually have it is in this collection called Kramer's Kentia. And in there, he's quoting someone named Apollinaris of Laodicea, who claims to be quoting Papias. So we've got this transmission, third hand, way later than like when Papias is actually writing. So there's concerns about that. The bigger concern is that Kramer's Cantia quotes Apollinaris of Laodicea in two different places, both in the commentary on Acts 1 and also in the commentary on Matthew 7. He quotes the same fragment. He attributes it to Papias in both times, but what he says about it, he contradicts himself on that. And one, Judas is said to be killed by worms, or he bursts on his own land. And the other one, he says he gets run over by a wagon. Whereas in the other one, he was only his head was the size of a wagon. So there's definitely similarities between the two, but they can't both be going back to Papias. And so then there's a textual question there of, how much of this goes back to Papias? Which one? Does either one? So that alone, I think, is a reason to not make this the death knell of whether we trust Papias or not, because this is already a very textually messy fragment from Papias. That's one point. The second point I make is that because we don't have the context, we have no idea what Papias is doing there. Is he trying to harmonize an urban legend with the account in Matthew 7, right? Is he trying to, is he just, saying that this is a legend that sprouted up? We don't actually know if this is something he's saying actually happened. The third point is the one you brought up, going back to the scholar Christopher B. Zeichmann argues that Papias is engaged in what's known as an ekphrasis, which is this ancient rhetorical type of, yo mama so fat, like you were saying. Is that what he's doing? That seems kind of plausible because we have ancient textbooks saying how you are supposed to do the proper ekphrasis, and Papias's writings about Judas, if this does go back to him, does seem to map pretty well onto that. But the final point, and the one that I think is the most important, is to just highlight that fundamentally it doesn't really matter that much because we're not depending on Papias as a historically reliable source for this information. We're depending on him as a conduit, and this information is actually coming from someone he identifies as John the Elder. I think it's John the Apostle. We don't have to get into that, but ultimately it's coming from this John the Elder guy. So all we need Papias to do is to reliably transmit this information to us, even if he himself is a bit uncritical about what historical information he chooses to report. So even if the whole thing is a silly, crazy story and Papias is this idiot like Eusebius thought, right, who doesn't know what he's talking about, he is still a source telling us what early Christians thought and believed. And so if I'm right about all 4 gospel authors going back to Papias, that's definitely going to challenge the thesis that these names are all late and it starts with Irenaeus. Even if Papias is not that trustworthy, minimally you have to push the names back a lot earlier to, I mean, even if you want to go to Carrier's date with 130, that's still 50 years before Irenaeus.
Yeah. Okay, so some stuff. The first one, the one about the rhetoric and the maybe it was some form of comedy. Okay, I thought that was really weak, honestly, because look, the justification was that this appraxias, like the style is that you start describing a person from the head and then go down towards the feet. That was like almost the whole thing, really. But I think this is a very generic way to describe somebody. Like I was reading just by chance, I was reading a book from Brandon Sanderson, or a fantasy book, and he describes like a monster that appears. And you know what? How he does? He begins with the head and then moves toward the feet. Because if you begin with the head, then it's weird to go to the feet and then to go to the middle, right? It's weird. So I think that's super generic. So you really can't say, okay, he was doing that. And saying that he was maybe talking about a legend and trying to harmonize it, I don't know. But we will have to look at the guy who quoted Papias. What was he saying? Was he saying, is this quote like out of context, or was he saying, okay, Papias told us how Judas died like this, or does he say Papias explains a legend that he heard? Because it seems like he would have done it, right?
Yeah, it's a super garbled fragment. It's really hard to tell because, again, it's coming third hand to us through this patchy textual stuff. So it is really messy. It's almost impossible to tell what's going on there.
So what you say about this being messy and we don't know, okay, you're right about the contradiction. It is weird. But when you say that, okay, somebody must have misquoted Papias at some point. And it seems to be that opens another entirely different kind of worlds how do we know that those other things we have from church fathers, that all of that has been quoted correctly, right? Like, I don't know, maybe there are a lot of stuff that have been misquoted wrongly, right? I don't know. But yeah, you're right. Like there's something too weird. Maybe he had a longer version and then he wanted to make it like not so long, and he wanted to abbreviate it, condense it himself. I mean, he came up with that. That's how the shorter version ended up being existing. I don't know what happened, but okay, you want to say something?
Well, I say neither do I know what happened. I think it's worth pointing out that it's not just this like clear case that Papias said all this ridiculous stuff about Judas. Like people like Carrier and Ehrman just kind of put that out there and leave out that this is like really one of the least credible Papian fragments. And I say it's just a very uncertain hook to hang your argument, against Papias on that.
Yeah. They're also going to point out to where Eusebius called him a dumb, and they also like that's a little bit to the cumulative case in a way, But okay, what I think was your important point. You made that point last time, I think, is that Papias doesn't have to be a reliable historian; he has to be a reliable conduit. Okay, but here's what I think. The kind of personal traits that make a person an unreliable historian is also going to make you an unreliable conduit, like being gullible, not being critical of sources, like believing everything they tell you. Like, I don't see like how this really saves like the thing,
Could you sort of explain why that is? It seems like on its face that you could have well, like let's just take Google Books, like as an example, right? Like Google Books, you can look something up into there, and it can bring you all kinds of bad information, right? But it's still going to be a reliable conduit of whatever information it's bringing to you. That's kind of what I have in mind. That as long as Papias is like accurately relaying the traditions that he's heard, even if he's not being very like critically minded about which ones he accepts as true and which ones he accepts as false, he could still maybe even a better example than the Google Books one
I
would
get it.
be
Yeah.
like if I had a child attend, a Baptist church service, right, where the preacher just spouts all kinds of nonsense, right? And then I ask the child, like, what did we learn in church today, right? They can still tell me, like, what they learned in church, even if it was total nonsense that they learned.
Yeah.
So really what I'm saying is I really just need Papias to be getting the information from John the Apostle to us accurately, and there doesn't seem to be any particular reason to doubt that.
Yeah, okay, sure. Yeah, but what I imagine, for example, in the case, Papias was gullible, and that's why he believed some guy who told him Judas had died this way. He believed some legend. And then what happens is that the things about John the Elder, he didn't go that firsthand from John. This maybe the same thing happened. He believed some guy, whoever guy who told him, "Hey, I met John," and he, because he was gullible, he immediately believed him, and that the same thing happened, for example.
So you would actually have evidence against that in Papias himself, though, right? Because Eusebius preserves another fragment from Papias from the introduction of his 5 books, where he talks about his method, where he said that he sort of liked to get his information from the horse's mouth, right? He said he liked a living and abiding voice. So what evidence we do have about Papias's methodology would lead us to believe that when he says the elder used to say this, he's implying this is something that he himself heard. That's sort of what his description of his own sort of methodological procedure would lead us to expect.
Okay. Yeah. Again, I think we talked about this exact point last time. Yeah. What I said back then is, I think there is some prologue or somewhere when he thinks it came from second hand. Like it was some people who told him who they have heard this from John, and he heard it from them. That he doesn't really say, "Okay, I heard this directly from the John." I think that's what we say last time. I think that's what Bart Ehrman or Apologia made this point in a video. I don't remember at this point, but I don't really remember. Yeah,
Yeah. I'm not sure what part you have in mind there, but yeah, as far as I know, I just know that in his introduction, he says he likes to get it from a living and abiding voice. So.
Yeah, but it could be a voice that told him. A living voice is just a living voice that told him that John had said that, right? It doesn't necessarily mean directly John's.
Well, that is true. Yeah, I mean, you could posit he's getting it third hand. I guess just purely philosophically, I'd say now you're kind of adding in unnecessary complexity, unless he says he's getting this second hand from someone else. But sure, technically that's possible.
Yeah, sure. Okay. There was another point you made. I think it is important. I think it fits with the second point. You made a point about Evrius, the book of Evrius, right? You said in that book we had a fake attribution or a contested anonymous book, a truly anonymous book, and we see what happens when we have a truly anonymous book, when it gets presented to early truth. We have debate, we have controversy, we have discussion, we have people disagreeing, right? You said, see, this is an example when a really anonymous book gets presented like this, that happens. And that didn't happen with the Gospels. So this shows that it wasn't like that, right? That was an argument you had.
Yes, that you've got sort of broad unanimity, or at least very broad agreement, and no anonymous manuscripts, with, again, possibly P1 being the exception.
Yeah.
But yeah, in the case of the book of Hebrews, we definitely have anonymous manuscripts. We have people like Origen saying only God knows who wrote it, and you have Clement saying that Paul wrote it. You have other people saying Timothy wrote it, people saying Luke wrote it. So you have disagreement among the patristics as well.
Okay. First of all, when you say, we have no anonymous manuscripts, right? This guy has of history. He made a response to you. He said, when you don't tell people that it's only 3 manuscripts that we have, it sounds more impressive than it actually is. Like when you say, all the manuscripts we have the titles. When you say it like this, people saying like, okay, we have a ton of them and all of them have the titles. But it's actually just 3 or something like that. That's what he says in the video,
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
correct.
seem to remember him making that particular point.
Yeah. Okay, but my point about Ivrius. Okay, what I wanted to say about Ivrius is this. Maybe the reason why there was controversy is because people were attributing it to Paul, and people knew how Paul's style was. So we had the chance. They had a chance to compare to Paul. They knew about Paul's style, vocabulary in general, and they were like, "No, this doesn't sound like Paul." So in that case, that's what they were. Oh no, this is not. No, that's fake. But in the Gospels, we don't know how Matthew's style. We don't have Matthew's style to compare it to. So when they show them a Gospel, tell them it's from Matthew. That's why they didn't complain. So that's what I will read my counter response.
Yeah. So what I make of that is it commits a version of what I call the Goodacre fallacy. And where that comes from is when Mark Goodacre is, of course, an eminent scholar of the especially on the synoptic problem. When he sort of tries to explain why all of the patristics say that the Gospel of Matthew is written first, even though modern scholarship thinks Gospel of Mark is written first, his explanation for this is that, the Gospel or the later patristics, they were thinking that, this is the one that's written by Matthew, right? So it just had to be written first, right? It's like he thinks that they are thinking like modern biblical scholars, the patristics. He thinks that they are trying to figure this stuff out via inference. And it seems to me what you're saying about the book of Hebrews is kind of commits a version of that fallacy. It would be one thing if you had these people saying, well, like, no, it had to be written by, Luke instead of Paul because there's a difference in style here, right? Or it has to be written by Timothy instead of Paul because, stylistic differences. The issue is, so far as I know, you don't have that. They don't attribute this in anything to like an internal analysis of the evidence. They just seem to be passing on traditions. And that really seems to be a lot more how they thought about this stuff, kind of doing these analyses of the similarities and differences between excuse me, not that you didn't have any of that in the early church. Of course, you have famously in early harmonizations of the gospels and things like that. But it's not to say you have none of that, but they really they don't tend to approach the gospels that way. So I don't really see the evidence in the competing voices that the reason they're attributing it to someone else is based on a stylistic difference between Hebrews and Paul. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. So another point, this has to do, a similar point has to do with Luke. Okay, now I think the early church, they will have 100% noticed that Luke and Acts have the same style. Okay, obviously, the same author. They will have missed that. So, because one of the points you made in the video, and this is a super popular argument by apologists, is why would they, if there were someone came up with, okay, let's go into invent names and attach authoritative names. And your point, you also is why would they invent Luke? Why would they invent Mark, right? So I think Luke is actually very easy. This is already a bad argument because it's very easy to respond. It's obvious that the author of Luke is the same as the author of Acts. And the author of Acts says he's a travel companion of Paul. So you cannot say, okay, this was written by James. That's not going to work. So it has to be the travel companion of Paul. That response, I think, Luke, is easy to respond. As to why they didn't invent someone better for Mark, yeah, I admit that's a good question. If they are going to invent, right, they would have said, yeah, this comes from Peter. My guess, my hypothesis, they wanted to go back to Peter, but the Gospel of Peter, the name was already taken because there was this fake gospel. There was Gospel of Peter, Acts of Peter. So it was they didn't want it to get confused to people to say, oh, it's the Gospel of Peter, right? So it's that one that's already fake circulating, and that's what maybe they didn't name it Peter. Or maybe Mark did write Mark. I don't know. I think it's possible. Or maybe there was a tradition already that Mark was Peter is an interpreter. Like everyone already knew, people were saying, yeah, Peter used an interpreter, a Greek interpreter. His name was Mark. So it wouldn't make sense for Peter to write that, right? It would have made more sense for Mark to be the one who write it. So something like that. Maybe, yeah, that's something I would say about it.
Yeah, I guess a couple points by way of response to that. So with regard to Luke, that works if you're going to acknowledge that the we passages in Acts are intending to insert the author into his own narrative. The problem there is then you have to face that argument down for traditional authorship, because now you do have an internal first person identification of the author. I think generally critics of traditional authorship have not wanted to acknowledge that. They want to give some other explanation for the we passages. So that explanation is only going to be open to you if you're willing to stare down an independent, arguably stronger argument for traditional authorship. So I'm not sure that.
So, but yeah, so you just a small complaint. I don't need to accept the we passages. I need to posit that the early church accepted the we passages, right?
Well, okay, yeah, I suppose that would be fine, but then that would still cause tension, I think, with a lot of the skeptical explanations for the we passages. One of the most common ones, and I'm not saying this is one that you accept, but one of the most common ones is like, this was just, common of when they were talking about traveling on a ship. It was a literary motif to say that, we were doing this. There's no evidence for that, but argument for a separate day. Point being, if that was correct, then you're going to have to explain, if these were like just accepted references, why isn't the early church getting them? So I'm not sure it's quite as simple as just saying, oh, I just have to accept that the early church would have said it. But point being, it gets you into some, I'm not saying it's decisive, but there's some explaining to do if you want to go with that story for how Luke got attributed to the third gospel. With respect to Mark, I mean, I don't have a knockdown argument against that, but generally the idea is that, as I understand the anonymity hypothesis, they generally want to say that the canonical gospels, they needed to be attributed to sort of apostolic authorities once you started having debates about them in the late 2nd century. And so Irenaeus, or, someone from around that time, attributed them to apostles, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So the counter there is to say, but Mark is not an apostle, right? So for you to say, well, maybe they wanted to attribute it to Peter, but there was already a gospel of Peter, so they went with his interpreter, Mark. It's like, that's kind of working against what we're saying the purpose of these attributions was, right? And it's not like you don't have other apostles to choose from, right? Like, you've got Bartholomew, right? You've got a James. You've got plenty of other...
James that got martyred very early. Acts say so. So maybe that goes a little bit against that.
Okay, yeah. Maybe you don't want to go with James. But point being, you've got several other apostles that you could attribute this to. So it just seems weird. If you're trying to give it a fake apostolic authority, I still think there's a question there of, why Mark? Again, not knockdown, because obviously you could tell a story like the one that you told. But I do think it's a point worth raising if the hypothesis is the names are added on there to give them fake clout, Yeah,
I get it. No, I get it. Like, ultimately, I don't really get why. I mean, why is that all implausible that Mark? I mean, why do skeptics want to they attach Mark from Peter? I guess because it's easier to say, if the Gospels are a product of a long chain of oral tradition, it's easier for embellishment and a legend to creep into the text, right? But if Mark got it directly from an eyewitness, right, then like you have to say he's lying or something.
Yeah, I think there's also a bit of a reactionary effect. Obviously, it's on both sides of the issue. So, like, apologists like me are very drawn to like the most rock rib, conservative position possible, right? Like, if possible, I want to say that, like, Matthew wrote his gospel with his own hand. I think you've got a little bit of a reactionary effect on the other side too. That skeptics just like don't want to grant anything that might sort of concede any sort of credibility to the case for Christianity. And so if you can deny like any association between the Gospel of Mark and Peter, then like there's gonna be some sort of psychological inclination to go there. I mean, I get it because I have it in reverse.
Yeah, of course. No, I get it, because when I think about it, it's like normally if we have testimony saying a guy wrote this, normally in like almost every case, that's enough, right? That will be enough to say, okay, then a guy wrote this. But and you have to be a little bit ad hoc, so to say, well, no, you have to deny in this case. And for me, I think maybe my point number 4 will do a little work. So we will get to that later. Well, the point is there was a lot of fake attribution already going on. But okay, let's go. Let's see the point number 3. Right? Pallmann makes this point all the time. It works stronger with Matthew and John. He says that the text is really, the Greek is really good. Is rhetoric. Is there? As a complex narration. There are like literally themes and whatever. And at some point, sometimes I also hear like there is symbolism, and Mark is doing symbolism with, or Matthew is doing symbolism with Old Testament, and he's trying to fit this Old Testament to twist into do things, and it's like this super complex thing that only a literally master today will think of making this weird metaphor or whatever. And you're telling me that some peasant from Galilee, was able to do it. I'm like, no, man. And the point Pallmann makes is that we have like 2 people, to one writer, one person who could write Greek, from one Jew from Judea, like from the period there was like 2 or 1 person we know of that could write Greek, right? And so that's unlikely. But there is something I don't get about this. Maybe you can even explain it to me. I don't get his point. I don't even get his point, because okay, but somebody wrote Mark, right? So we did have some people who were able to write Greek. So I guess maybe the point he's trying to make is, no, this was an Hellenized Jew from later on, from other place, not from Galilee. I think maybe that's what he's getting at. I don't know. Do you know what about this?
I think that is the general point he's making. Urban has a really weird way of calculating probability. So he's a thoroughgoing frequentist when it comes to calculating probability. So if you want to ask Bar Urban, what is the probability that this occurred? He's going to say, well, let me count, how many times did that occur elsewhere? As you know, I am not a fan of that method of calculating probability, but I think that's what we have on display here. He's saying, well, how many examples of people from that region do we know who are able to write in Greek? Oh, we only have 1, so therefore probability is incredibly low. Let's just, leave out the fact that the majority of stuff that was written in that time hasn't even survived till this day. So my thoughts on this particular argument is that, honestly, I'm not completely sure what is meant by, so when you sent me the email, right, you had said like a text like that. And I'm a little concerned that there could be some question begging going on here, as far as like what all are we saying is in there that it would have been so improbable that they could write. And I'll let you explain how you want to understand this in a moment. But typically the way that that's gone is there's this assumption that, there's all these complex Greco-Roman literary devices in there, right? You're dealing with chiasms, and you're dealing with this symbolism and this imagery and all this blah blah. And like, I'm sorry, like I'm a pretty hardcore McGroupie on this, right? So I would broadly agree with the thesis of like Lydia McGrew's book, The Mirror, the Mask, where she just argues that stuff that modern scholars are reading into the Gospels, and it's just not there. So if that is what's meant by this, like a text like that means including all of these fancy schmancy literary devices, I'm just gonna say, like, I kind of don't accept that that's there in the first place, but maybe that's not how you're understanding.
No, Chris, I agree with that. I think sometimes people like overthink things, and they like to they like to come up with this really contrived, literally symbolism, like, this symbolizes this other thing, because this, you can see like a parallel or a relationship, but it's very, post hoc, Okay, but whatever. No, I don't. I didn't mean just that. I mean, no. I mean, first the fact that it's in Greek, it's in good Greek, and second, I think Matthew, for example, shows signs of. I think I don't remember. I think many people say that maybe he was a rabbi or had education somehow similar to a rabbi because he seems to know a lot about Scripture and Old Testament. So he's like a really highly educated person in theological issues. He's just not the kind of person that a tax collector would have been. And what I meant by that is not the real literally things. I mean just like the redaction itself. Like there is good redaction and there is bad redaction. Sometimes you read something and like, hey, this prose or an article on the internet, and you're like, oh, this is very well written. You can tell that the person is really good. It's just that. I mean, I had an example, but I don't want to offend anyone. But I'm gonna try to make an example. Like, let's say you see a philosophy paper on philosophy, and it's really good, and it shows familiarity with philosophical literature and with the moral ontological argument and moral logic and stuff like that. And then somebody goes and tells you, okay, these were written by this guy who is a blue collar worker. By the way, guys, I'm a factory worker myself, so I'm not going to offend anyone. They will tell you like this guy who is I don't know, truck driver or whatever. I think he wrote that. Okay, there is a point where you say, really? This is super complex philosophical paper, dude. No, man, you're kidding me. Okay, so yeah.
So a couple thoughts. I really think the only gospel this is going to apply to is the Gospel of Matthew, right? The Gospel of Luke, probably put it aside, right? By all accounts, Luke is a Greek physician. Those people had to read, so we can put that one aside. Mark is not written in terribly great Greek, right? It's famously written in some of the worst Greek in the New Testament, right? So we can put Mark aside. John is, some of the most simple Greek in the whole New Testament. So we can probably put John aside. The one this is going to afflict is Matthew, right? Now, Matthew is said to be a tax collector. There's some, disagreement between apologists and counter-apologists as to what exactly does being a tax collector entail, right? But let's say that you're right, and this doesn't mean that he would have had to have any sort of particularly sophisticated literary background. I guess the most I could say here is that some people have the talent to be able to write. So, for example, I don't mean to brag on myself, but people have told me I'm a good writer and that I'm generally conversant with the topics that I write about. Now, like you, I'm also a blue-collar worker, right? I worked as a truck driver for a year, right? I work as a vertical technician now, right? So I'm not somebody who has, I've been to Bible college, but it was Bible college is Bible college, Most of what I write about, I did not learn at Bible college. So there are people who are capable of writing despite not having, particularly good training in the matter. I'm not necessarily saying I'm in that category. I'm just saying I might not be the sort of person, if you looked at like my job resume, that you would expect to, write about authorship of the Gospels or the argument from, logic or the ontological argument or blah, 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 right? Fundamentally, the question is, what do you do with the evidence that you have? And I think we do have a considerable amount of evidence that the Gospel of Matthew was written by Matthew. So even if maybe reading it, we wouldn't think, oh, well, this was, hired muscle to collect taxes. If you have a good amount of evidence that is suggesting that, then I feel like that's at most just a very small degree of evidence probably against it. Not something that you couldn't overcome with. Sorry, I know I'm bloviating, but those are my thoughts.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Well, that's okay. That's fine. I don't sure if John can be be declared to be absolutely non-problematic because you still have the issue. Okay, a fisherman from Galilee would be very unlikely to even know how to write Greek. This is not like learning English, like many people can learn that. This would have been super difficult, and composing a text would have been Bart Ehrman goes a lot about this, would have been a really high degree of difficulty. And I don't know, did you watch the debate between Bart Ehrman and Mike Licona, the recent debate on this topic?
I did. I posted some thoughts about it on Facebook, but I don't know if you're over
Oh, you
there.
have Facebook. I don't have you. Well, I'm gonna follow you on Facebook. I haven't. I don't even know you have one. Okay, yeah. Because what Walikona wants to say is that they use scribes or secretaries, right? You know.
Well, and I do think in the case of John, and maybe we will get into some of my thoughts on the Gospel of John at some point, but I do think the Gospel of John employed a scribe.
All
And
right.
I think we have both internal and external clues for that. As far as Mark and Luke, I don't think that they did. Matthew, I'm open to that, but we don't have the external and internal clues of that the way that we do in the Gospel of John. So I'm open to that with the Gospel of Matthew, but I don't personally believe that the way I do personally believe that with the Gospel of John.
Right. But there was a very funny moment in the debate. I'm even going to make a video about this. I don't know if you remember when Bart was cross-examining Mike Licona, and Bart was like, "Okay, give me an example of." So he says that this never happened. We don't have an example of a text being written, a scribe being used in this way. And Bart is like asking Mike, "Give me an example of somebody else who did this." And he's like, "Oh, well, Mark and Luke, well, Matthew and John." But he's like, okay, that's like where we are disputing, right? Just give me somebody else aside from that. And Mike is like, well, Matthew and John. And but he's like, no, I bet somebody else. Give me somebody else. And then he repeats again. He's like, okay, Mark and John again. It's like, it was so funny,
That
I
was
don't know.
that was definitely not Lacona's best moment in that debate. And maybe I'm off here. Here was the answer that came to my mind when they had that exchange in the debate. I was like, why does he just not say the Apostle Paul, right? Like we know the Apostle Paul uses a scribe, right? At least for some of his letters, he directly says so. There's I forget the exact book, but there's one where he says like, see how I'm writing to you with these large letters because I'm, writing with my own hand. So implying that was abnormal for him and that Paul typically was using a scribe. Now,
Right.
maybe the idea is that, well, the Gospels are kind of different from the Apostle Paul.
Yeah. That's what Bart
Obviously,
was.
in some ways they are, but I mean, that's pretty similar to what you're
Yeah.
asking for, right? It's a scribe writing for someone. I mean, like, gosh, do we really have to demand that it has to be the exact genre? The Apostle Paul seemed to me like the better example to bring up. But those were my thoughts on that part
Yeah.
of the debate.
Okay. And maybe we can go to the last point. And I think, or like I said at the beginning, skeptics don't often bring this up, but I think it's a strong point. Like there were a lot of forgeries, like in the environment, like already many the apocryphal gospels, Gospel of Peter, Acts of Peter. Like we see a lot of fakes, a lot of forgeries. If you read Bart Ehrman's book Forged, there are a ton of examples of writings of people misattributing writings to somebody else or writing fake. So if that's already being done, if there's a lot of fakes, people are doing a lot of fakes, then that gives me a little of a higher chance, justification for saying, that maybe these were fakes as well. So what do you think?
So my first thought when I read this part of your email was you're saying like this was common during that time or during that era. And my first question is, what exact time or era are you thinking about? Because it
Yeah,
seems
yeah. I'm thinking this during this. I'm saying during this context, and I read that's something I read in this that article I mentioned you in the Infidels. You remember that I told you that I think there was they say that at some point like fakes and forgeries were widespread in this context in the early Christianity. That's in general. Yeah, I bet you're going to make the case that they started doing fakes later. The gospel were early, and only later is when they started doing all these fakes. Is that what you're going to say?
well, so that was the first part of it was to say, I was like, I'm not sure the Gospels are actually written in that context. It seems like that context actually comes later. Now, I want to agree with you. It's a degree of inductive evidence against it, but let me explain to you why I don't think it's that strong, right? So let's just take the Pauline corpus from the New Testament, right? Let's take the standard scholarly view that 7 of these books are authentic to Paul and the rest are forgeries, right? Okay. now we have this context, right, where there's a lot of epistles being forged, right, for the Apostle Paul. So the question is, does that by itself give you all that much evidence to think that Romans is not authored by Paul, or that First Corinthians or Galatians or Philemon are not authored by Paul? I want to say it doesn't really give you that much. In fact, forgeries sort of presuppose that there's something authentic that's come before. So applying the same sort of thing to the Gospels now, I want to say, well, look, we have some earlier Gospels that I think are authentic. And then when those kind of take off, become a thing, then people start forging that. And that's when you start getting these forgeries. So I agree. It's a small degree of inductive evidence against the authorship of the Gospels, the traditional authorship. But, for the same way, if I accepted the standard scholarly view on, the Pauline corpus, I would say that all these forgeries is a small degree of inductive evidence against the Pauline authorship of, say, the Book of Romans, but not anything like enough to warrant the conclusion that Romans is not authored by Paul. For the same reason, I say it's not anything like enough to conclude that the Gospels are not written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah, I think that's a fair point. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about your case, like your positive case for the gospel. Because in 50 minutes I have to talk to Apollos. We're going to talk about the alien hypothesis. Like, I actually agree that the alien hypothesis is bad, but not for the reasons that he says it is. It's not because the aliens have parts or whatever. But okay, that's another topic. You will see that if you okay. But just to mention, in 50 minutes I have to go. But
50 or 15?
50.
Okay.
50.
All right. Well, we can talk about my case for the gospel. I want to talk a little bit, I guess, about the Gospel of John, if that's all right with you. So we've got this interesting passage right at the end of John's Gospel, chapter 21, verse 24, where it says that, the beloved disciple, he wrote these things. And we know that his testimony is true, right? Now, this is kind of an interesting passage because on the one hand, it's like this clear statement that an eyewitness wrote these things. And then immediately after that, you've got this sort of disjunction between we versus his. So kind of what do you do with that, right?
Yeah.
Then we also have maybe I shouldn't say a lot. We've got 2 or 3 external sources saying that Papias is writing the Gospel of John for the Apostle John. And then you also have a whole bunch of external testimony effectively saying that Papias was a disciple of John the Apostle. So you've got the strong connection between the two of them, and then you've got explicit statements that Papias is involved in the composition of the Gospel of John. What I think is going on then is that you have a gospel written by Papias is actually penning it for the Apostle John. And then I think that you get sort of the first edition. I'm not quite sure when to place that. Then I think John passes away. And there was this rumor when John was around, right, that he was going to live until Jesus returned. So what I think you have is some additions made at the end of the Gospel of John by Papias, basically saying, but that's not what Jesus said. He didn't say that John would remain until he returns. He only said, if I want that to be the case, what is that to you? So I think that's something added by Papias. And then this bit about, yes, it's written by the Apostle John, and we know that his testimony is true. I think those are added in by Papias. That seems to make the most sense of the internal and external evidence to me. So I think you have broadly Johannine authorship with a couple of Papian additions. That's my view on the Gospel of John. I'm just curious, what do you make of it? Yeah,
about John 21. Yeah, I don't know that much about it, but the first thing I was going to say is, Alex O'Connor, scholars say that John 21 was added to the ending, right? That the ending is in John 20 verse 30 or something, that it works as an ending, and the next part seems like it was added, right? Another thing, what I find something a bit weird, why when they say it was this was the test based on the testimony of the beloved disciple. Why not say John? I mean, it's a small complaint, but why don't use the name? Like, given that it was.
Do you think it might have just been because it was just known that John was the apostle that Jesus loved?
Really? Okay. No, I don't.
That Richard Bauckham has an interesting argument in this book here. Bauckham has an interesting argument in here that basically means that it was just like so well known that John was the beloved disciple that there was no need to say that. I don't know if you buy it or not. I thought it was worth mentioning though. But sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no. Sure, no, I don't know that much about it. So yeah, you can fill in the gaps. But John, the beloved disciple, right? I mean, it just seems a bit strange. Nowhere in the gospel, I think the connection is made explicit, right? And I don't sure if well, I will have to look at what other sources mention John being the beloved disciple and which year is this honor. So I don't know what evidence to Bauckham appeals to. And yeah, no, he is. So we have a person saying that this goes back to an eyewitness, right? But the thing is that the power was added later, so it's like now it just completely. It's not like the author is telling you that, right? And you think it's Papias, but again, I will also have to look at the exact quotes on why do you think the sad thing is that a lot of Papias is lost, right? We only know from some quotations here and there, so we don't know. But don't you think in the part that where Papias is talking about, we know that Mark wrote the Gospel of Mark, Matthew wrote the Gospel of Matthew. Do you think it's very weird there to omit? And I wrote the Gospel of John, and I was the scribe for that, right? Do you think this will have been like, because he's talking about the Gospels, and he's saying we have these Gospels that go back to, and to omit John there, it seems so weird to me,
Well, he may have, right? We can think of a really easy reason why we only have this this material as citations in Eusebius's ecclesiastical history, right? And we know that Eusebius doesn't like Papias. He really he dedicates this whole section to disassociating Papias from John the Apostle, right? He argues that, oh no, there's two different Johns, and Papias was with this John the Elder guy. So Eusebius actually goes up against Irenaeus on this point, and is actually like, no, Irenaeus is wrong. He was not a disciple of John the Apostle. He was a disciple of John the Elder, who was this different John, right? So Eusebius has this whole section in ecclesiastical histories where he is trying to distance Papias as far as he can from John the Apostle, because he doesn't like Papias's eschatology, and he doesn't want it to have any apostolic credibility, is basically the reason there. So we can really think of very clear reasons why, if Papias had said something like that, Eusebius would have axed it, because he is going out of his way to distance Papias from John the Apostle. So those sorts of statements could be in Papias's works. I don't know. It wouldn't surprise me if they were, but I don't think anything significant turns on the fact that it can't be found in Eusebius, because we know he would have cut that material if he had it.
Okay, but I think that makes Eusebius a really big liar if he's going to crop out the part where Papias says he was a scribe for John, and because I think that that was the other point I was making earlier, and Paulogia and Pallmann made this point. It's not so clear that Papias was the disciple of John the Elder, and you can discuss a little bit about this, right? What was the name of that guy? You told me you think this guy makes the best case against traditional authorship. I remember watching
Michael Koch, K-O-K.
Yes, I watched a Joto video about him once. He was saying again, he said the same thing you said. He says that at some point, John, there was somebody in Asia Minor called John the Elder that got confused with John the disciple, right? He has I don't know what is the evidence for this or anything, so that's too deep for me, but the case has been made there. So, but the point, here's my thing. One thing is to debate, okay, based on what Papias say, was he the disciple of John the Elder or whatever? Or was this the same? Was John the Elder John the the same the disciple, but another thing is to lie blatantly, like so much that you're gonna crop out the part when he's saying that he wrote the gospel for John the disciple. Like in that's it. Like I don't, they don't. Eusebius doesn't strike me as that's doing too much. I think I don't know. What do you?
He might not too. As I said, I would not be surprised if one day we were to find Papias's works and find out that something like that had happened. But I admit that's just conjecture on my part. I'm not saying he did do that or anything like that. I'm just pointing out Eusebius obviously is quite biased against Papias.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Sure.
And sorry, more than that, he's just biased against him. He's particularly biased against him being associated with the Apostle John.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know what else. I don't have any other points about John. I don't know.
I guess maybe.
One thing. Don't you think John is a little bit too late to be written by a direct eyewitnesses? Because we have to think John would have to be like 90 or something when he wrote that. I mean, it can happen, but there is a point when that adds a little bit. It's like not only you have to be alive, you also have to be. There are people that are at 60, 70, they are really mentally, like their cognitive faculties decline already, right? So you have to be also able to do that. So there is a point where you say, okay, it's getting too old for this to work. Right?
Yeah. I get that. The thing is, we do have, if I'm not mistaken, and I can't cite the sources off the top of my head, but I'm pretty sure we have explicit external sources just saying that John lived to 90 some years old. So, if it was just something we had to put together, I could kind of feel that point. But because I believe we have external sources specifically saying that John just wouldn't die. The guy kept going and going. And I think we have an indication of that in the Gospel of John, right? This whole, I brought it up earlier, this passage saying that if I will that he lives till I return, what is that to you? It almost seems like that was people were taking that seriously just because he was living for such a long time. So it does not strike me as I get it's unlikely taken in the abstract that someone would live that long, but because it does seem to me that we have specific external attestation and even something in the Gospel of John itself that kind of hints that he lived for a really long time, whether you think Jesus actually said that or not, the point is at some point this became a thing in the Christian subculture that John was gonna live until Jesus came back.
Okay. Yeah, when you say, okay, we have people saying that he lived until he was very old age, where he was 90. I would say to that, well, yeah, because they think he wrote the Gospel of John, right? So he had to have lived. So it's not like, okay, we have independent confirmation that he did live that way. No, it's the same. These people are saying that because he must have done that in order to write the Gospel, right?
Okay, but the other thing, though, is that all of these people, I'm not sure that they would date the Gospel of John as late as you and I might.
Okay.
I seem to recall, is it Irenaeus who puts the Gospel of John quite a bit earlier than that? Yeah, sorry, I'm not as knowledgeable in this area, but I don't know that all of them would actually put the Gospel of John quite that late. So I'd have to look at the specific sources saying that he lived for that long. But I mean, I take the point that you're making.
Yeah, okay. You sure. No, yeah. Well, I mean, what else you want to bring up? Anything else?
Well, so you did see my video, so I'm curious about this point. What do you think of the idea that Irenaeus is getting his gospel tradition from Polycarp about who wrote the Gospels? Do you remember that part of my video? Or?
Yeah, I remember those parts, but they were very okay, I don't know anything about this. It was
okay.
I do remember. Wait, Irenaeus was getting. I rewatched it actually recently, and I still don't remember it.
That's fair. It's not a big long section.
Yeah, Irenaeus was getting his gospel from Polycarp, right? I know there is a part where you appeal to differences in vocabulary and style, like this sentence here being quoted, really is really similar to this this word here is this order is very similar to this word, so it probably came from here. It's stuff like that, right?
Yeah, basically where he recounts in Against Heresies 3:1:1 when he definitely names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He talks about this being like received, and then in his letter to Florenius, he talks about how he received the gospel, this stuff about what Jesus said and did. He received this from Polycarp when he was a young man. The language there is like really similar. I don't claim it's certain, but we know that Irenaeus was a student of Polycarp, and we know that a lot of the information in Against Heresies comes from Polycarp because he tells us that. So it doesn't seem like too much of a stretch to say, hey, maybe that came from Polycarp. I admit it's kind of speculative, but it strikes me as plausible.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. Yeah, I don't know. Anything else you want to bring up?
Let's see. Well, we covered a lot of territory here.
Yeah,
I'm not sure if anything is coming to mind that I
Yeah,
initially want to bring up on authorship.
maybe one. Yeah.
Well,
maybe
I guess.
one last. Oh, go ahead.
Well, you can bring it up if you want. I was just gonna say, like, what do you think is like the main reason that you don't accept traditional authorship? Because you said it's like late. It's late attributions was kind of the one with the most weight
that
for
one
you.
is pretty strong to me. Yeah, that one I think is pretty strong. And I don't know, you're not gonna like this reason, right? I mean, I think ultimately deep down, the reason is because I'm a skeptic, and I had to do it because it works better for the other argument that I want to make, right? That this is a product of a long chain of things. But I don't know if there's a way to turn this into an actual argument. And you're probably not gonna like this argument. What if it's something like based on the human arguments against miracles and against the supernatural? And I would say, because the Gospels are talking about events that violate the laws of nature, therefore they cannot be witnessed. Because they cannot be witnessed, therefore they cannot have been written by eyewitnesses. Therefore they must have been written by somebody else. It's like it would be the argument that you think this will be doing some of the work there against authorship in some way.
I would venture to suggest that's actually the main reason why most skeptics are skeptical of it, because honestly, when I look at the evidence, I obviously there's differences between assessing gospel authorship versus authorship of Tacitus and Plutarch, but like it looks pretty darn close in terms of the quality of the evidence to me. I mean, neither one do you have the person identifying themselves. You have a lot of external testimony, and that's sort of the reason why it's identified. And if it weren't for the fact that the Gospels reported miracles or were being supportive of Christianity in some way, I do wonder if we would have the same level of skepticism. So in some ways, I appreciate your honesty there.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Well, I don't know. That might be a good note to end on. Or sorry, did you have something else you wanted to
bring up?
No.
I think that's like a good. We can wrap it up also. So yeah, if you want to say some final words to the audience about where your material or whatever. What do you want? No, it's all.
I can. I mean, if people have thought anything that I said in this conversation was interesting, you can get a lot more on my YouTube channel. It's called Faith Because of Reason. Juan already kindly said he would link my video on this specific issue in the description, so you can get my full case there. And yeah, I mean, again, thanks for having me on, Juan. I always like you. I think you're a friendly stand-up guy, so even though I disagree with you on stuff, I do enjoy our conversations.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thank you too for coming or for taking the time. It was a great talk. And yeah, guys, so go check out his channel, and please like and subscribe to my channel. And thank you for watching. See you next time. Bye.